Had their way, Americans would right now be facing the largest tax hike ever. You know, their proposal was to raise taxes very substantially. And our proposal, which is in the great, big, beautiful New Deal, it's a New Deal in its own way. It's a Republican version of the New Deal. Right behind you is a nice picture of FDR. This is a much better deal than the FDR deal.
Forget everything you knew about the U.S. economy. Trump just sat down in the White House, pointed at FDR, and declared a Republican New Deal. This isn't just a tax cut. It's a total takeover of the system.
Congressional Democrats had their way, Americans would right now be facing the largest tax hike ever. You know,
Kevin Warsh to head up the Federal Reserve, something that legacy media completely...
52% of our fellow Americans own no financial assets. They don't have equity in their house. They don't have an account at Schwab. They don't have an account at Coinbase. They're living off their W-2 income. And this surge in prices have destroyed them. Yeah. It's the most regressive tax any government could ever come up with. Imagine if we had a central bank that had been deadly focused on that. I think we wouldn't have taken a divided country and made it more divided. When we have a big balance sheet, we're asking for the inflation that came. And as a final point, my own judgment is the story that I hear from many of my peers. Well, the inflation, well, that's not really the central bank's fault. That's because of Putin and the pandemic. Nonsense. A change in prices happens in a market economy because of shocks in the world. Changes in prices happen every day. That's not what inflation is. Inflation is when that change in prices become embedded. It's second and third order effects. And that's what's been the biggest harm to the country. My recommendation is a smaller balance sheet, takes the Fed back to a more manageable size, a more serious job. And interestingly, if you can have a smaller balance sheet, you can have lower interest rates.
Did you catch that look on his face? Trump isn't just talking policy. He's essentially declaring regime change at the Federal Reserve. By nominating Kevin Warsh, he's putting a guy in charge who has openly called the current Fed's moves nonsense. If you're watching the markets, this is the moment the independent Fed basically joined the cabinet. Warsh is talking about a smaller balance sheet and lower rates, a combination we haven't seen in decades. He's calling out the regressive tax of inflation and blaming the central bank directly, not just Putin or the pandemic. It's a complete 180 from the Powell era. You're looking at a Fed chair who wants to run the bank like a partner to the Treasury, not a separate entity. This effectively ends the 50-year experiment of central bank insulation. It's aggressive, it's risky, and it's exactly what the Republican New Deal needs to fund itself without exploding the debt.
1991, America's first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, delivered something called the Report on Manufactures to Congress. In that report, Hamilton articulated a plan for the United States to shake off its economic dependency on the British Empire. In that report, Hamilton argued for a strong economic policy that would allow America to become an industrial power. He called for a combination of tariffs and subsidies to incentivize industrialization. Hamilton believed that such measures were necessary to promote the development of industries, like textiles at the time, that needed protection from dominant foreign producers to develop the scale that would allow them to supply US needs and also be globally competitive. This vision, as I will discuss, laid the foundation for American and even global prosperity in the 19th and 20th centuries. Hamilton immediately shifted from words to action. He created something called the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures, and he founded the city of Paterson, New Jersey to sustain this. It was a government-backed industrial organization, and it made large investments in textile infrastructure and soon blossomed into a massive and durable industry. This growth continued unabated for about 2 centuries, and by the 1890s, nearly half of all silk in the United States was processed in this tiny city of less than 9 square miles. Now, what's interesting is that the manufacturing ecosystem that emerged in Paterson made it a hub of activity far beyond textiles. New factories kept springing up in the city, making rail cars, pipelines, and weather balloons. A prototype submarine was developed in Paterson, New Jersey in the 19th century. And by the 20th century, Paterson had become an aerospace...
This is the part most people missed. Jamison Greer is out here at the Freedom 250 event, essentially reviving Alexander Hamilton's 1791 playbook. They are literally going back to the Report on Manufactures. Think about that. The US is pivoting away from a globalized service economy back to 19th century industrialism. They're using Paterson, New Jersey as the blueprint. The strategy is clear. Use tariffs to force companies to build here, then use subsidies to keep them here. It's Hamiltonian economics on steroids. They want to turn the US back into a manufacturing powerhouse that doesn't rely on anyone else for critical tech. It's a massive middle finger to the Davos crowd, delivered right to their faces. If this works, the Made in USA label is about to become the most dominant force in global trade again. And here is the fuel for this whole engine: copper. Trump signed Executive Order 14220 for a reason. 50% tariffs on copper imports are now live. Why? Because you can't have an AI revolution or a new power grid without it. He's essentially cornering the market for domestic miners like Giant Mining out in Nevada. By taxing the imports and forcing domestic scrap to stay in the US, they're trying to build a copper wall. It's a supply chain play that makes the US the only place where you can get cheap, domestic, high-quality copper for semiconductors and defense. It's a brutal move for global competitors, but if you're looking at the long game for US infrastructure, this is the foundation. The New Deal is here. Are you ready for the 1791 comeback? Subscribe for the next move.